evening, Kinky Boot Day. As you've just seen in the intro, it's not escaped my notice that somebody's been twiddling with nature. We see patterns repeated everywhere. It's always fascinated me that these patterns always seem to repeat themselves. Link to a video and song of mine called Clouds in My Coffee in the description. Clouds look like swirls in water. I mean, if they're going round. Swirling milk in water looks like a spiral galaxy. Neural pathways look like the network of galaxies in the universe. A tree in every leaf. Leaves come off the twigs at particular intervals, segmented or odd. The tree we've just seen, much like a lung, you have the main trunk and then a bifurcation and then more bifurcations and. You'll probably know about the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio, and all of these things that create repeated patterns. The Fibonacci sequence is to be seen on things like the petals of a flower or sunflower seeds, this swirling pattern. Neural tubes, we are chordates, vertebrates, and there's a symmetry to us: 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, center line, philtrum, our brains in 2 hemispheres. We went through an embryonic stage where a neural tube was created for the nervous system, as with all vertebrates and chordates. There's a standard model of particle physics that has a beautifully symmetrical system, and the further you go down, the simpler it gets. We now have 3 generations of particles, leptons and so on. Why there are 3, nobody really knows. The thing is, there were several, and then less, and now 3. I see a pattern forming here. It seems the further you go down, the simpler it gets. So will the 3 generations end up being actually 1 generation? If I follow a branch back from the ends where there are hundreds of twigs back to the single stem, if I follow the swirling pattern of a cloud, if I could reverse the film, it would congeal into the drop of liquid that I put into the water in the first place. That wouldn't happen with a cloud, of course, but who knows. Point being that I find it rather suspicious that there's all this pattern forming going on, and I'd like to know who's doing it, if you don't mind. There will be consequences. Max Tegmark would say, well, it's all mathematics, because there is nothing other than mathematics. He's convinced that the universe is in its essence mathematical. Religious people would leap on and say, well, it's obviously the work of God. There is a hand in this design. Some scientists would say there are laws, there are charges, there are limited combinations of things that can produce a possibly infinite array of variations, like in evolution. So you start off with simple single-celled organisms, and you give it environments and tasks and the ability to interact and make choices. And I'm saying you give it, I mean it is given, its environment is there, the tasks are there, the choices can be made, choices that offer themselves in the environment, so they can combine with other organisms and create new organisms. So you can swallow the seed of another organism into yourself if it has a use, as trees have done in order to do photosynthesis, and as we ourselves have done. Our microbiome is an adopted organisms that we use, or they use us for convenience sake. So we see, a great diversity from simple things. Simple thing, bifurcation, 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 complex thing. But that means you're able to follow it back to the simple thing at some point. And then there are patterns of erosion that we see where you've seen those pictures where you can't tell whether it's arteries or capillaries in the body or the meanderings of a river, the deltas of oceans or rivers rather, that look like they could be pictures of a neurological network or something deep in biology, organic. So it's a bit suspicious that things seem to follow a pattern of always more complexity. And as with the Big Bang, you then have to ask, well, what would happen if we wound the clone back to the first moment? And the complexity of the universe wound back would bring us back to a hyper-dense, hyper-hot, hyper-homogeneous point called a singularity. Just like the patterns in a leaf can be followed back to the stem of the leaf, which can be followed back to the twig, back to the branch, and the branch back to the trunk. Ultimately, everything going back to one thing. And that's always fascinated me, that seems to be the case, and that no one seems to be fascinated by this. In fact, it wasn't so much later that I discovered that there were people who examined this from different points of view and came up with mathematical formulae, explanations, Fibonacci, Mandelbrot set, fractalization, even patterns of fur discolorings on cows or animals that have patterned fur or patterned skin. There's an excellent video on YouTube by Veritasium about how women are stripy and why. I'll try and put a link in the description. So there are all these subtle pattern generating systems going on, and I find it fascinating, and I see it in nature, of course, as we all do, unless you're as blind as a bat. Are bats blind? I don't think they are. And so I have to then ask if that seems to be the pattern in all things. Is that the pattern in our neurology? So we have a highly complex brain. If you follow not the biology but the cognition back to ever simpler layers, matched with the biology, of course. So you have your mammalian neocortex, many folds and highly complex. Which allows us the cognition that we have, and crows for that matter. Recently they have decided are conscious, as in aware. So you follow that back to the simplest of reflexes, no requirement for great cognition necessarily. How far can you follow that back? Could you follow that back to the point where consciousness disappears and there is no need for consciousness, say in plants and so on? Although the work of Monica Gigliano, I'll correct that if it's wrong, and I'll put a link to one of her talks. I'm sorry if I got that wrong. Her work makes you think twice about consciousness of plants. So does consciousness disappear at some point? A worm, a beetle, an amoeba, no consciousness, no awareness? Or does it reduce itself down to nothing but awareness, just simple awareness, just the activity of being. Interesting. Neil Turok says the formulae for the description of the universe, all of its charges, all of its interactions, every movement of particles and so on, can be written on a t-shirt. As if on the greater scale it's very simple. And there is an argument or a theory that we live in the complex part of the world, that the further you go down, the simpler things become, and the further you go out, the simpler things become. And it's the messy bit in the middle that creates the complexity. So if you were to look at a cloud, generally it would just look relatively homogeneous. If you look right the way into a cloud at the smallest things, a bunch of water atoms would seem relatively homogeneous. But the bit in between is the bit where the chaos and order, where the battle goes on. So we live in the messy part, basically, where messy's tidy room. It's fascinating to think about where complexity comes from, where it's going to. I said about the oils in the water getting muddy. The muddiness is simplicity, isn't it? It's just muddy brown. The initial colours you put in are quite simple. It's the bit in the middle where it swirls that creates the complexity. And our psychology, our cognition, is sometimes seems to be like that for me. There's a place, a state of simple activity, and then there's this messy chaos that we get ourselves into. And then beyond the messy chaos, it seems to become so much that you can't take it anymore, and you revert to or enter another state of simplicity. I give up. You submit. So it's a fascinating subject. Hope I'll get all those links in the description, because they are interesting people to listen to. I, as always, run up against the idea of creation and the creator, and have to deny that idea if it's the Western Abrahamic idea, or if it involves any kind of what seem to be human generated gods. But nature, principles of nature becoming ever more fundamental, possibly to the point where there is only one fundamental. I find that beautiful, the idea, and I can imagine that being the basis of all of this. I can imagine a fundamental property, a fundamental activity, a fundamental non-activity manifesting itself, or this emerging from it in ever more complexity, in a myriad of ways, physical world, energy, matter, and with things that we can't explain, like consciousness, the thing that is so obvious, and yet there is no physical explanation for it. Well, it's just interactions of particles. Oh really? How do particles interact to create this? Well, it's just a complexity in the brain. That's a cop-out as far as I'm concerned. So it's a fascinating subject. I don't have an answer. I wish I did. Or do I? I'm not sure. In any case, I wish you a beautifully complex and yet simple life.